Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Viktoriya Fedorchak. I'm a senior lecturer and docent in war studies at the Air Operation Division, Swedish Defense University. Today, we're gathered here to talk a little bit about one of the most recent developments in the air warfare in Ukraine, specifically trends in drone warfare and how experiences in Ukraine are impacting these developments. So, let's talk a little bit about that. First of all, before we start addressing various developments in the drone warfare in Ukraine, we need to emphasize one important thing. How did it happen that Ukraine ended up having so many drones, its production, its implementation in war fighting? Well, it's important to emphasize that with the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion, Ukrainian armed forces didn't have significant numbers of the conventional air force. As a result, there was a greater need to have some aerial assets across tasks, across missions, and across domains. So another reason for that, for the need for drones was actually also the focus on ground-based air defenses during the interim years of the war, meaning between 2014 until the full-scale invasion in 2022. So these factors, they influenced the necessity of having some aerial assets, and drones were one of the ways to fill in this gap. In this regard, we observed that drones provided cheap solutions to the existing gaps across domains. So, yes, from the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, we saw the greater use of some foreign-produced drones, specifically Bayraktar TB2, which allowed for some firepower being available in support of the ground forces, but also striking various targets at the front line and onwards. Over the years that followed, the existence of Ukrainian military industry and the availability of still quite capable knowledge base allowed to produce a greater number of Ukrainian drones across different tasks and roles. In this regard, we will talk today about more kinetic roles and what type of achievements these drones managed to provide in the warfighting. We'll also talk about some supporting roles of drones and where things are going, but also some trends in terms of how different drones contributed to the warfighting capacities, but also some logistics considerations in making these drones most effective in the entire system of the warfighting in Ukraine. So, but first of all, let's talk a little bit about the current trends. So obviously what we observe is proliferation of drones across domains and tasks. This was, as I mentioned, conditioned by the lack of sufficient aerial assets in each of the domains. So from the ground forces perspective, tactical drones allowed tactical ISR. Small drones pretty much were eyes in the air, allowing ground forces to see what's happening in the battle space. The same goes for the urban warfare and the ability of seeing what's happening in various buildings. So this type of drones were quite important for that. Also, we see development of the long-range strike drones and loitering munitions, again, for the same reasons as I mentioned previously. Proliferation of drones also results in increased tempo of warfighting. The more you have availability of real-time data, the better your situational awareness, the more kinetic capacities you have at the tactical level, the more decision-making you can conduct on the tactical level. Hence, on both sides, there is a greater stimuli for strengthening this decision-making and also tempo of warfighting. Also, the more assets you put into warfighting, the more assets are there across domains, the greater is the necessity to deconflict between various units, between various services, and also to make sure that you're not resulting in the phenomenon of blue on blue fire. So hence you need to deconflict, and after that the next stage would be cross-domain or cross-service and cross-unit integration, which again happens to the greater degree depending which area we're talking about. Another trend is the necessity of new skills. So obviously you need to teach your people how to operate drones, you need to teach them relevant tactics, and we'll talk about what some of the armed forces and armies are doing in different countries in Europe and how they adopt various experiences from Ukraine. Combined solutions of the military industry, grassroots startups, and the armed forces. This is another lesson or trend in Ukraine, is that various elements are working together in order to have the best solutions. Because as we observe, the frontline armed forces, they illustrate what is needed, and startups and military industry, they can develop these solutions based on what is needed in the front line. So again, it's a very fluid dialogue. It's not something that's been how should I put it, long-term planning. It's more immediate necessity with immediate solution with a little bit long-term planning based on scaling up some of the initiatives. So that's kind of what's happening or has been happening for quite some time. Now we can talk about more kinetic use of air power and specifically drones in our lecture. So in this case, as was previously mentioned, Ukrainian armed forces didn't have sufficient numbers of conventional aircraft, and they were not as modernized as adversaries. So obviously, drones had to compensate for that. The best illustration of this compensation is actually work of the Birds of Magyar, and as they became known, unmanned systems forces. Although they make up only 2% of the Ukrainian armed forces, they are responsible for 1/3 of the Russian combat losses. Again, it's a very significant achievement, and every time when you see significant attacks deep into Russian territory, or if you see attacks, strikes at Russian logistics hubs, oil refineries, all those things are being conducted by this specific unit. So they illustrate how long-range drones, how air reconnaissance capacities allow you to have significant achievement in the battle space. Yes. Another development within their activities is strengthening layered air defenses with interception drones. Again, anyone who watches news in Ukraine, they observe that there is a greater necessity of air defenses. And again, Ukraine is known to build a pretty functional layered air defenses. However, with the increased intensification of Russian strikes, there is still a greater need to strengthen these layers, and one of the solutions that they're working on is actually developing this interception drones. So that's kind of another contribution to this layered air defense system. Another point that was made by Magyar regarding this is focusing on unit specialization in the assigned terrain. So it's suggesting that people need to focus on what they are doing on the ground in terms of air defenses within their specific area, specific terrain, instead of being constantly moved between different areas and again different terrains. So the point is that they need to become expert of their own specific area rather than being everywhere all the time. So again, skills development is very important here. Another element to consider refers to more supportive role of drones, and this refers to transportation or mobility role of drones. Why are we talking about this? Why is this so important? Anyone who observed the developments in the warfare in Ukraine, changes in the front line, stabilization of the front line, establishment of mutual air denial, they see that the front lines, the kill zone there has become very much contested. It's quite difficult to provide the basic logistic support there. And obviously, no one wants to lose people on the ground during the logistics supply missions. So one of the solutions was actual automation, both ground and aerial automation, as a means of delivering cargo, delivering support materials, food, that sort of stuff, ammunition. So in this case, we observed that the last mile delivery was devoted primarily to the unmanned drones. One of the examples that you can see here is British-produced wind racers, ultra logistics drone. We observed that the cargo delivery weight is up to 150 kilograms, and the distance can be 1,000 kilometers. So again, this is quite important because it allows to, first of all, save lives, but also to save resources, because that can be done with automated capabilities instead of, something old-fashioned, people in a truck that will be targeted by adversaries' UAVs. The trend here is that there will always be the necessity of larger weights, bigger cargoes to be delivered. So as a result, we observe this need to carry at least almost 200 kilograms for a longer distance. So this is kind of what they're working on right now. From the Ukrainian perspective, the equivalents, they managed to reach the cargo of 90 kilograms, which again, these things are still developing, but in any case, they are pretty successful. So these things are going on. Another thing to consider, and I think it was already mentioned in various discussions, various lectures and analysis, is actually creating innovation. I really like this phrase by Air Marshal Johnny Stringer from the British Air Force, and he named Ukrainian innovation focused innovation, meaning that Ukrainian armed forces combined various platforms from small, medium, and big technologies in creating app-based ISR and command and control. This is quite important because it wasn't just innovation for the sake of innovation. It was dictated by the necessities of the front line, by the necessities of specific units. And as a result, we see how innovations were targeted towards that, how they fit into the entire system of decision-making, of performance in the battle space. So these things did work pretty well. Today, as we see the change of warfighting in Ukraine, well, today, over the last, I would say, 2 years, the shift has changed slightly. The focus has been placed more on making bigger numbers and also on combining this grassroots sources of innovation and solutions with a bit more traditional, a bit more centralized way of scaling them up. So obviously, great ideas, they need to be scaled up. You need to produce them at mass and to make sure that they are where they need to be. So these things do need to change how we think about them and how we produce them and how we procure them, and I'll talk a little bit about these things onwards. So again, depending where you're standing in the warfighting, what type of warfighting is taking place, and whether you're moving towards protraction of warfare, you might need to have different solutions, and you might need to have different approaches to innovation and to production of your capabilities. Numbers do matter these days. Okay, another point that needs to be taken into consideration is situational awareness. So you can't really achieve much if you don't know what is happening in the battle space, especially in such a contested airspace, battle space, pardon me, where you need to know where the enemies are, where your friendly drones, where your artillery is, and all these things trying to operate at the same time. As we previously mentioned, you need to make sure you have this ability to deconflict. You need to have this ability to then integrate with other assets to have the most effective result. So you need to decide how certain target can be taken down using different capacities rather than trying to use all of those capacities and waste resources. So situational awareness very much defines what you will be doing with what, and have a good knowledge of the targets and where you are. So Ukrainian solution, which was quite highly praised in NATO, was actually a Delta system. So Delta system is a Ukrainian cloud-based integration platform allowing access to various tools for situation awareness and real-time mapping of the battle space, taking advantage of various sensors, trackers, radars, and satellite providers. So in 2024, it was aimed to provide the situational awareness, streaming services for the UAV and stationary cameras, secure chat, planning tools, integration of the robotic systems. But very few things remain the same in the warfighting. So already this system, over a year and a half, it evolved to provide additional functions. Some of the functions that it provides is actually tracing the performance of different units. It provides you with additional statistics and some other perks as the battle space progresses. So again, very few things remain static. Yes. So another important thing to consider is that you can't really achieve much if you don't pay attention to logistics. Procurement process is incredibly important. It's as important as having sufficient numbers, because you might have certain capabilities in your storage, or you can make the orders. But if these orders are coming too late, or you have a very old-fashioned system that takes a lot of time to deliver relevant capacities from the storage to wherever you need them, again, their effectiveness can go down and it might not be needed anymore. Simple as that. So in this case, it's important to consider how do you procure your capabilities, specifically when we talk about drones. It's quite important to have them right here, right now, as soon as possible, because their turnaround can be pretty fast depending on the area of the front line. So Ukrainian solution, again, 2024 and now 2025, with further modernizations, refer to the DOT, or State Logistics Operator System, digitalizing logistics systems. So basically, here the idea was that you can have a more systematic approach to this, using a digitalized environment where you can order things pretty much like we are ordering through our system online, whichever way, ordinary stuff. But here the important thing was that it improved efficiency by reducing delivery times from around 2 months to just 15 days. In the warfighting environment, this is a significant improvement. Most importantly, from the drone perspective, already in 2025, it allowed brigade-level units to directly order FPV drones, electronic warfare assets, and robotic systems through this app, basically. So that was quite important achievement and development. Okay, nothing would be possible if we didn't have people, the right people in the right places. So we can talk about how great drones are, but there are still people in the loop and people who are guiding them and making them happen, so to speak. So drone operator skills, this is something that many armies in the and armed forces in general in Europe are thinking about. They're developing their own schools, preparation centers to build up develop these drone operating skills. Very often they also engage Ukrainian armed forces, Ukrainian veterans, to share their experiences. Another element is actually minor repairs and adjustments, meaning that some things ordinary soldiers would need to be able to fix where they are, so that they would have some type of knowledge at that level, how to do that without, spending time of sending drones back to major repair areas and centers. Also, we mentioned tactical warfighting skills. The way the war has evolved, drone warfare is a very niche type of warfighting. It has its rules, it has its limitations, you can say, but very much experience defined how you adjust to the warfighting with the enemy, especially on the tactical level with the drones. And I must say that Ukraine actually has this experience, and many allied nations, or allied armies, are actually praising this knowledge and taking advantage of them. They are learning from what's happening in Ukrainian battle space and how drones are being used there. Yes. Also skills of the civilian population to assemble drones and find new solutions. In Ukraine, it became very important, but also see the developments in Europe these days, that some countries are actually looking into how civil society can get involved in preparation of for the potential conflicts. And in this case, we observe that even providing people with like basic skills how to assemble drones can speed up their availability, their procurement, and their delivery. So that's quite important element there. Collaboration between civil society, startups, and military industry, well, I very much mentioned that. So that kind of goes as a given, because it's a war fighting for the entire country, for the entire society. So you can't really fully, how should I put it, fully divide all of the elements as saying you're just doing this and nothing else, and you're not involved in anything else. Yes. So in terms of some points for consideration, drones became an integral part of modern warfare, and they're here to remain. This is definitely the case. We can observe it in the current situation in the Middle East. Drones are being used by various adversaries, and believing that potential future adversary will not use them, I think it's a bit challenging to do that. So we need to prepare for the drone warfare in terms of counteractions, in terms of what type of targets they can reach, that sort of stuff. And I also use them in national warfighting as well. Warfighting experiences in Ukraine were observed by NATO and their future adversaries, and hence cannot be ignored in preparing for the next war. It's important to realize the next war will not be the same as the one has been fought today by one country or the other. However, various experiences, various lessons will be taken into consideration when the next war will be fought. As I said, we see the same situation in the Middle East right now. Terrain still would have an impact on the extent of drones' effectiveness, but they have a role to play in any type of modern warfare. Again, depending on the type of warfighting, depending on the objectives, the utility of drones might vary, but it doesn't mean that they won't be there. They will be there. So we need to prepare for that. And I will always emphasize the importance of civil-military nexus in the whole of society approach, because it's particularly relevant from the perspective of drone warfare, for counter drone solutions, but also for providing this kind of critical mass, building drones and actually providing them to the armed forces where they are needed. I'd like to finish my lecture with good old-fashioned Sun Tzu. He's The Art of War views on adaptation. And he argued that those who are able to adapt and change in accord with the enemy and achieve victory are called divine. Therefore, victory in war is not repetitious, but adapts its form endlessly. The important thing from our perspective, modern perspective, where we stand in these days, is actually to realize how we need to adapt. What kind of lessons, what kind of points for consideration can be adapted for the national settings, because nothing else is static and nothing remains the same. Adaptation and being open to this adaptation are quite important elements for the development of the armed forces and the ability to prepare for forthcoming challenges and crises that we'll have to face. Thank you very much for your time. I'm glad I could share some of my ideas with you today. If you have any questions, please contact us directly. Thank you. Bye.